On behalf of the Borough of Cochranton and the CARE organization and the French Creek Valley Conservancy, we want to welcome you to our second program, delving into the rich history of the watershed here. This year we'll explore the turbulent times in the valley of the 1750s. Tensions were really running high in the French Creek Valley in the 1750s. A young and inexperienced 21-year-old Virginian was sent into the region to challenge the French occupancy and discover the loyalties of the native inhabitants of this frontier region of western Pennsylvania. This would be a great premise for an epic story, and it all happened within walking distance of where you are seated today. This will be a twofold focus of our efforts today. First, will be to first guide you on a journey of discovering the facts of our history and how that would impact the growth and development of our nation. Second, we wish to entertain you and give you a unique opportunity to explore living history. We're lined up a scholarly panel to touch on the elements that impacts our story. We'll look at the ecology and the biology of French Creek Valley and why it sustained the early native population. We'll look at those early Native Americans. We'll delve into how the French laid claim and how they intended on securing it. We'll take a close look at that Virginian and his mission. We'll then relate to you how these elements impacted the world. Our first speaker this morning in the program is A Land of Riches, the Environment of the French Creek Valley in the 18th Century. Our presenter is Chuck Williams of Williams Ecology, LLC. Dr. Williams was professor and chair of the biology department at Clarion University, teaching coursework in biology, ecology, and environmental studies from 1992 to 2006. His interests in current research projects are centered on the historical ecology and landscape archaeology of the French Creek and Clarion River valleys. Dr. Williams holds a BA in botany from Drew University and MS in entomology from Rutgers, and his PhD is in ecology from Virginia Polytechnical Institute and the State University, which is Virginia Tech. Dr. Williams has taken additional coursework in archaeology from Oxford University and serves as a Fulbright Scholar in Environmental History, University of Iceland. Dr. Williams currently teaches several courses in earth sciences and biology for Waterford University, Waldorf University, and Columbia Southern University. And it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Chuck Williams.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here this morning and talk a little bit about environments past. That's something that I have a very, very deep interest in. And the French Creek Valley is, I think, pretty unique in that there's a pretty good documentary history of some of the events, many of the events that unfolded here, but also of the past environments. And that information about the past environments you sort of have to dig for. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. The French Creek Watershed, you probably all know it well. It's located largely in Pennsylvania, northern portion in New York. It's about a little over 1,200 square miles in area, and about 11% of the drainage basin of the whole Allegheny River. French Creek watershed is largely glaciated, and that's a pretty important factor. Glaciated soils tend to be much richer. They're relatively newer and they're less weathered, so there are more nutrients available, particularly for plant growth, and that's a very important aspect of the richness of a particular environment. French Creek Valley also has very diverse soils, from upland soils to submerged soils and hydric soils, and a variety of upland, wetland, and freshwater habitats. Now, probably one of the things that really jumps into our mind when we think about French Creek, I know it jumps into my mind, is the rich aquatic biodiversity that we have here. It's among the best in Pennsylvania, if not the best in Pennsylvania, with 86 species of native fish. That includes 15 darters. Down there in the bottom right corner is a rainbow darter, Ethiostoma cerulea. 28 species of freshwater mussels. Freshwater mussels are among the most sensitive of freshwater organisms to pollution, so to have an array, an assemblage of 28 species is quite something. And up in the top right is a species of French Creek. That's the wavy rayed lamp mussel. And then finally, one of my favorite critters, I think it's iconic in the French Creek watershed and in other portions of the Allegheny Basin, and that's the eastern hellbender. How many people have actually seen eastern hellbenders? Hey, that's not bad. All right. So, great aquatic biodiversity here in French Creek, and that's a reflection of the richness of the environment. Now I want to talk a little bit about the past environment. And what did the French Creek Valley look like in the 18th century? So we're trying to sort of tunnel back in time and see what the environments were like. And the big question is, how do you study the past environments of the French Creek Valley? Well, for the most part, it's studied by documentary evidence. There's a lot of other ways that you can get environmental information through pollen cores and a number of other things. But the documentary evidence basically gives us our first cut on what some of the environments of French Creek looked like in the 18th century. And those documentary pieces of evidence are largely writings of those who sort of passed through the environment doing other things, particularly soldiers and also surveyors. So who were these soldiers and surveyors? There are more than I'm going to talk about, but these are some of the ones that you might be familiar with. Of course, George Washington and Christopher Gist in 1753. Henry Bouquet, Colonel Henry Bouquet in the French and Indian War was in this area from 1759 to 1760. And along with him was a very intelligent young man named Thomas Hutchins, who was here 1759 and 1760. It says 1760. And then sort of a little bit later on, but still highly relevant, is Jacob Eyerly. He was a surveyor that worked for the Moravians. And there's a classic picture of Gist and Washington crossing the Allegheny River on a raft. Of course, George fell in and Chris got frostbite, so that was a rough trip. So the big question is, why were these soldiers and surveyors here? And French Creek is sort of the eastern extension of what was called the Ohio Country back then. And the Ohio Country was a relatively rich and also contested country by the French, by the English, and by the Native American inhabitants. Washington was here to serve notice to the French forts from Governor Dinwiddie of Virginia to basically leave. Their forts Michaud, Leboeuf, and Presque Isle. Bouquet and Hutchins basically were in mop-up duty after the French leave the forts after the fall, particularly of Fort Niagara. But Jacob Eyerly was basically here because of the Erie Triangle sale and the grants that were given to the Moravians of 5,000 acres. And he made some interesting observations. So the next question is, how did they access the French Creek interior? Well, one of the most important areas of access for the French Creek interior was the Venango Path, particularly the northern portion that went from Venango, which is currently Franklin, up all the way through Presque Isle and through Leboeuf and et cetera. So this northern Venango Path was a pretty important link between Venango and Presque Isle, used by many, including all of the individuals that I mentioned earlier. And Venango itself was a pretty important place because it was sort of a place where a lot of different Native American trails intersected east and west, north and south. So Venango was sort of a trail nexus, if you want to call it that. So first I'm going to focus on George Washington's French Creek travels. Again, he was sent here in 1753 to gauge French intentions and basically try and tell them to bug off. He arrived at Venango on 4 December. Okay, he's here in the middle of the winter. Not quite the middle of the winter, but at least the beginning of it. And when he was here, the weather was rough. And that is a tough time to make environmental observations. And he was on a mission. You know, he wasn't so much concerned, hey, that looks really nice over there, great meadow, although he did mention those types of things. I think George came up here and didn't quite know what to expect, and that sort of had to temper what he was doing, what he was observing. So he made some, but not many, observations on a local environment. So what did he have to say? Oh, one other thing. French Creek basically will forever be entwined with George Washington because he was the first one to call it French Creek on a map in 1753. Of course, it's had a lot of different names over the years, French and Native American. So, Washington, going from Venango to LeBoeuf in December 1753, this is what he says. At 11 o'clock, we set out for the fort and were prevented from arriving there till the 11th by successive snows, bad traveling, etc., through many mires and swamps. We were obliged to avoid crossing the creek. So this is the first that you're going to hear about swamps and mires, and there's a lot of observations across all those surveyors and soldiers about the wet nature of the French Creek Valley, particularly on the Venango Path. And here's a good one, and probably his most important observation. We passed over such good land since we left Venango and through several extensive and very rich meadows. Okay, so this is the first observation of extensive meadows, open areas along French Creek, one of which I believe was 4 miles in length and considerably wide in some places. So that is a huge open area. And I'll talk about why some of those open areas have existed in a little bit. Okay, so move on to Colonel Henry Bouquet and his associates from 1759 to 1760. They basically, as I said, followed the retreat from the French from the Allegheny Valley. And probably their correspondence contains the most detail of environmental conditions at the time. So these are really worthwhile observations if you're trying to reconstruct past environments. For example, hopefully this will all be here because I do not have this memorized. 11 October 1759 began our march through a large bottom and crossed Sugar Creek. We all know where that is. Continued along the ridge, land level and rich, through a rich bottom, well timbered, 3 miles to Custaloga's town, well timbered. So that suggests that this is a pretty good forest. 16 October, marched a mile through a pine swamp, 2 miles to LeBoeuf Fort. Now I should say, back in the colonial days, pine was a generic term, and that also included hemlock. And sometimes hemlock was called spruce pine. So probably this was a hemlock pine swamp, which is not uncommon in certain areas today. And then 17 October, marched through a swamp and then 5 miles through a pine swamp. Again, probably white pine hemlock. Then at Venango in present-day Franklin, Henry Bouquet makes this really great observation. I've been interested in riverine grasslands for quite a long time at Broken Straw and Conowongo and also at Venango. Here he says, Venango, the finest meadows I ever saw, some 2.5 miles long and 1 mile wide without a tree or bush. Again, an extensive meadow area. And this is interesting. And the grass, 5 feet 8 inches high. What do you want to bet Henry Bouquet was 5 feet 8 inches high? The Indians say there is, for 20 miles, several such savannas along the several branches, and you can't see the bottom, of the Beef River, another name for French Creek. And on the right here is a picture of freshwater cordgrass. There's probably at least 4 species that meet the 5'8" criterion that Henry Bouquet mentioned. Freshwater cordgrass is one, big blue stem is one, Indian grass is one, and switchgrass is one. And probably this particular alluvial grassland was a mix of all. So Franklin was a riverine grassland at one point in time. So Bouquet mentioned the Beef River. So here's a little aside here. The French also called French Creek the Rivière aux Bœufs. And of course, boeuf, and I'm not pronouncing it right, I'm sorry about that, is translated as beef, and so this is the River of Beef. And it's always been thought that this is in reference to bison that perhaps the French saw when they were building their forts. And this is something that's been debated for a while. And there's actually no hard evidence for bison in Pennsylvania. There's been some interesting literature written about it, but none of it seems to be based in reality. And at this time period, it was not unusual to name places after martyred individuals. And there's a hypothesis out there that perhaps this Boeuf, Le Boeuf, is actually a mispronunciation. Perhaps this is in reference to the martyred Father Jean de Brébeuf. He was a Petun Huron missionary in Michigan. He was a gifted linguist, and he was killed in 1642 at Michilimackinac in Michigan. So, alternate hypothesis to the Beef River. So we move on to Thomas Hutchins, my favorite man, along with Christopher Gist. His march from Venango to Presque Isle in July 1760. Okay, July, this is great. This is the growing season. He's going to see some stuff, hopefully, and tell us about it. 13 July, march 2.5 miles through a low, rich bottom to Sugar Creek, back to Sugar Creek again. The bottom continues a mile further and is full of runs, so this is a well-watered land. And we now ascend another steep hill and alternately traverse little hills and low bottoms for 4 miles and then encamped. And this is an interesting point. The woods are open and very young. So we go from having well-timbered areas, pine swamps and hemlock swamps, to open woods that are very young. So something a little different there going on. And then Hutchins again in July 1760 marched through low grounds almost all this day, and we came upon a high sidling hill opposite to Custaloga's town, which was a Native American town that you're probably familiar with. 2 miles further are 3 Mingo huts, which was another geographic area. A mile beyond which we met with the richest meadows I ever saw. Again, back to Meadows. Quite clear for more than 2.5 miles. March 13 miles. Excellent food, fine open woods, but no timber. All right, so more open woods. What does he mean by excellent food? Was there a diner there or something? No. This was forage for the horses. So a great meadow, great place to basically fuel up your horses as well, but fine open woods. So why were the woods open in spots? Well, this is kind of interesting. In 1759, Charles Lee was coming back from Presque Isle and LeBoeuf towards Venango. And he says, we proceeded down the river about 40 miles and arrived at Venango, as he wrote it. The country on each side excessively fine. So he's saying this is one rich and beautiful area, and thickly settled by Delaware Indians. As you probably know, Native Americans had certain land use practices, particularly the burning of woodlands and meadows at certain times of the year, usually spring and fall, one or the other, and also their agricultural practices. So it's a good possibility that these open areas in these young woods were basically a result of Native American land use practices at the time. Alternatively, it could also be natural disturbance or both. Another thing here that's kind of interesting. 15 July, march through very rich bottoms commonly called swamps. Sorry, we got swamps again. Almost all this day. Found about 1/2 mile of pretty, I like the way he spells that, high open woods, then fell into a swamp 2 miles over, full of the largest cypress trees I ever saw. Anybody ever see a cypress tree in Pennsylvania? You can plant a bald cypress in places and they'll grow. This has been debate as well. What was Hutchins talking about? And I'm hypothesizing he's talking about larch or tamarack. And there's a lot of similarities between larch and tamarack. That picture above there shows a yellow tree. That's tamarack, and it is losing its needles in the fall. Bald cypress does the same thing. The other tie-in to this is Hutchins was a surveyor, and he spent time in Florida when Spain ceded some lands to Great Britain down there and spent time as a surveyor, so he was familiar with cypress there. So what looks like cypress down there, looks like cypress up here, must be cypress. He also put together this great map, and it's actually the whole Ohio country. And he put some geographic locators on certain things. I mentioned that the 3 Mingo huts area, if you look, there's a place called Mingo's Meadows. Towards the bottom here, the most lower arrow. Another place, Cypress Swamp. That's where those cypresses are, which we think are tamarack. And tamarack does occur in this region. And also Large Meadow. So this actually gives me a map to go out and look around sometime and see what's going on. I've only done some remote sensing work, but I've not done any ground truthing yet. And then finally, Jacob Eyerly, 1794. I'm not going to say much about him. He helped survey 5,000 acres of lands granted to the Moravians in the Erie Triangle. There were 2 tracts that were granted to the Moravians, one called Good Luck, which is the easternmost on this map, and that is right in French Creek proper, one of the branches. And then hospitality on the state line of Conneaut Creek. There's some interesting observations, actually very interesting observations he made at hospitality, but I'm not including those currently. So I'm going to focus on some comments on the Good Luck track on French Creek. Hopefully they'll all show up because I do not have these memorized. Okay, 27 May. Yes, they're there. Went to look at land along French Creek. Walked in grass up to the armpits in the bottoms beside the creek. So this is suggesting maybe a meadow that is transitioning to woodland. We don't know. It could also be an open area. 10 to 12 June, the French Creek tract is very good, rich land with many clearings in the bottoms where the Indians used to dwell. So this is another aspect of perhaps Native American land use, campsites, village sites, agricultural sites, and maybe sites that were burned. So there were clearings that he clearly tied back to Native American land use. And this is interesting as well. Where these bottoms are not cleared, they are densely overgrown with white walnut. If you're not familiar with that name, butternut is the other name for that. Wild cherries, probably choke cherry, but probably also black cherry, and the like. This is interesting. I have seen hawthorns there that were from 12 to 15 inches in diameter. You guys know hawthorns or thorn apples. A lot of times they're not even, 2 inches across, but 15 inches is incredible. That's like old growth hawthorn, which is not a word, 2 words I put together. There are all sorts of trees in the uplands, and actually he talks about tree diversity much more on the hospitality tract than he did on the Good Luck tract. Okay, so a little bit of summary here. French Creek environment, 1753 to 1794 in the basis of these 4 or 5 individuals. Much of the land was well watered with ample rivulets and runs, so that's perfectly great. Water sources available for drinking and also for irrigation and other uses. Level and rich land occurred along French Creek, as well as diverse upland forests, so a diversity of habitats. The level and rich lands, eventually good farming lands, diverse upland forests, good for timber. Hemlock white pine swamps were apparently common, as well as other wetlands, like tamarack wetlands that I'm hypothesizing the cypress wetlands of Hutchins are. And early writings indicate many open areas, savannas, meadows, and bottoms, some extensive, miles long, which suggests Native American land use, like burning in agriculture. But that's also probably in conjunction with natural factors, the saturation of the soil, the height of the water table, and those types of things that can restrict tree growth and basically favor grasses and herbaceous plants. So with that, I'll leave my technical support crew to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Question is, could you define the difference between blue stem and Indian grass? Are they out? Part 2 of the question, are they in the same family Andropogon, or are they something different?
I believe they're in the same subfamily. It's pretty easy to tell them apart when they are flowering. They get a little dicey when they're just in vegetative form. Indian grass is very distinctive, very tall, very different type of inflorescence than big blue stem, which basically has an inflorescence that is sort of 3-part. It's sometimes called turkey foot because of that. And also, big blue stem, the name actually is correct. The stems are bluish, but so are the leaves, much more so than Indian grass. So if you get out there and you start kicking around when the plants are in vegetative condition, you can sort of use that as a discriminator.
I don't want to dominate.
No, please.
One other question referring to the grasses. I see things that they look like Phragmites. Things that are these foreign things that have come in?
Yeah. I've done a bit of work on the Allegheny River Islands on invasive plants, and one of the grasses that has really come in spectacularly is reed canary grass. Now, reed canary grass is native, but it's also northern hemispheric, and there have been different varieties brought in from elsewhere, and they have hybridized with our native species to produce a super aggressive plant. And if you get out on some of the river islands, it's 100% reed canary grass, and it probably should be a mixture of the 4 grasses that I was talking about, depending on the scouring regime of the river. Yeah. Good question. Anybody else? No? Yeah.
What records do we have of the animals that the travelers or the Indians were eating?
That's really good. Like I said, Christopher Gist is one of my other favorite surveyor explorers, and I did a paper on him and his 1750 expedition going into the Ohio country in terms of wild game provisioning. In terms of French Creek, Christopher Gist, I went through his journal. He really says very little other than there was a deer harvested and 4 bears. But the bear thing is very significant because particularly in the Ohio country, they really, I wouldn't say they focused on bears, but when bears were there, they took them. Because they could render down the fat, they could make bear bacon out of them, they could make that meat portable. So those were pretty important things. Also, there's a real interesting anecdote in his 1850 journal about he's taken his horse through probably the Kentucky-West Virginia border, and it falls. And it falls on his pet Carolina parakeet that he had traded some Native American for, and he was very much put out by that. But, that's an interesting point, too, but Carolina parakeets are extinct, so it's just an interesting linkage to the past. But, yeah, that's one thing that's kind of thin in the French Creek portion of a lot of these surveys. Nobody's really mentioning much. Now, when you get out into the Ohio country proper, where we got elk, we got bison, we got deer, they are mentioning that.
An unrelated question. In Great Meadows, they talk about the grasslands there because of the high water table
Yes.
being a great place for grazing their horses. Mm-hmm. Sounds like this was a little tougher grazing up here for the horses. It sounds like a completely different kind of grass.
In spots, yeah. It's kind of hard to tell what those grasses were because probably all of these savannas along French Creek were put under the plow, and everything's been so perturbed that unless you get into some bog areas and you can take some pollen cores, it's really going to be kind of hard to tell. And some of those grasses you can't tell apart from pollen, so you can just get an approximation.
I mean, when I think of grass, I think of something like what we're looking at here.
Yeah.
And I kind of get that impression from Great Meadows too, maybe something like hay, as opposed to 5 foot tall.
Yeah,
stem of grass.
it's kind of hard to say what comes in where. That is a little more geographically distant from us and maybe more southerly influenced. So it's kind of hard to say, what might be there. But your observation on the high water table is right on, and that might have been a site too that Native Americans would maintain with fire, perhaps over time too. You've got the natural factor that creates it, but also the maintenance by fire. Hard to say. Any other questions? All right. Well, listen, I thank you very much. Thanks for listening.